Report, which explores journalism issues related to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of expression. My name is Jennifer Karchmer, and I'm the host and producer of the Transparency Report. You can find more information on my website, jenniferkarchmer.com. My guest today is Dana Priest. She comes to us from Washington, D.C. Dana wears a few different hats, but first and foremost, she is an investigative journalist with the Washington Post, with more than 30 years of experience covering foreign affairs, the military, and the CIA. In her investigative work, she's uncovered secret CIA prisons in Eastern Europe and deplorable conditions for veterans at the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, among other stories. She is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. She's an author, and last year she became the third John S. and James L. Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland in College Park. In other words, she is a college professor. Today we'll focus on Press Uncuffed. As a professor, she has led her students in creating this movement around imprisoned journalists and the issues of censorship. The campaign, in fact, says it is working to uncuff imprisoned journalists around the world and promote the free flow of information. If a journalist somewhere wears a cuff, so will we. We can see on its crowdsourced campaign, it's raised more than $30,000, and many of those funds will be raised, will go to CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists. So Dana, thank you very much and welcome for being here today.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to be here, and I am at the university now as we're speaking.
That is wonderful. Well, let's start with Press Uncuffed. More than 200 journalists are imprisoned around the world for doing their job of journalism. Most are charged with anti-state and retaliatory charges, but I notice even 45 of those have not even been charged. On a successful note, which is not something we often report when it has to do with imprisoned journalists, at least 4 of the journalists that you're highlighting in the campaign have in fact been released. So there are some successes. In fact, the most recent being Ta Phong Tan, who is a blogger from Vietnam, and she was just about a week or so ago released to the United States. So let's start with the campaign, how it got started, and again, some of those successes, but yet still some of the work that needs to be done.
Sure, the campaign started by students. I had a class, my very first class as a professor here at Maryland. And the class is, I still teach it, it gives each student an imprisoned journalist to profile. And the reason I did that is I wanted students to understand what journalists overseas put online, what they risk to do journalism, in a way to inspire them to understand the responsibility that journalists have in countries, but also to allow them to figure out how to learn a little bit about the national security, foreign affairs, our relationship with those countries, press freedom around the world, and then how do you report internationally without leaving the United States. And so combine those all together in this kind of personalized approach, which is to give each person one journalist who is alive, who is in prison. And the task is to profile that person, to figure out as much as you can about them, to reach into their network if possible, talk to their friends, talk to their relatives if possible, and to paint a deep picture about who they are. Well, it worked very well. The students, I would say most of them got very passionate about their journalist and the issues that they uncovered. Issues from, for instance, in Ethiopia, how so many bloggers were being imprisoned by the Ethiopian government in the name of terrorism, even though what they really were advocating for was free speech, free press, and what we would call pro-democracy values. To places like Mexico, which is very dangerous for journalists because of drug cartels, and places like Egypt, where there have been so many people put in jail as a result of the protests around the Arab Spring or the Arab Uprising in 2011, and then having a military government come back into power and then impose its own rules on the press, all in the name of national security. So we're dealing with a broad range of issues in each country, and each person was, is responsible for figuring out what is it in that country that really was a catalyst for for the authorities to put someone in prison, and where are the points of negotiation, if you will, like what does the country care most about? So they got so into this, the first class, that they wanted to do more than just write their papers, which was for the class. They also decided to do something which became Press Uncuffed. And it was this idea that they would sell bracelets that were reminiscent of the POW bracelets. I actually have one right here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's there. It's clear.
Oh, yeah.
plastic.
Yeah, hold it up. That's great.
On. This is Jason resin. And it's made out of clear, transparent acrylic lucite. And we have an alumni that helped us fundraise. We did a Kickstarter. We didn't know how to do any of this. We're journalists, but we learned how to do a Kickstarter. We raised this $30,000 that goes to manufacturing these. And then we are selling them for $10 a piece. And the money goes to the Committee to Protect Journalists, who does a lot of work with journalists who are in dire straits, today, who need to be either helped out of a country or given a safe house, or their families need to be given some sort of support while they're in exile. So that's where the money goes. But it also has sparked, a bigger look at this issue by the students. And on campus here, more students have volunteered now. So we're trying to turn this into a undergraduate free speech site where they can publish work on the subject of free speech. But we've also had this amazing success, and we can't say, it's because of this campaign necessarily. We can say that we have an active social media campaign around Press Uncuffed and around the individual journalists that are on the bracelets. We started with 9 that were picked in jointly with CPJ, who were the best, likely people we might have an impact with, people that we wouldn't end up doing more harm than good, because there are some countries where if you raise this issue, it tends to get the people in prison in trouble. So we had some great early success. We had 4 people so far who, from our original 9, who got out. And the very first one was Amar Abdurasul in Bahrain, who is a young photojournalist who was taking pictures of the uprising, and who was jailed and then went through a court trial and put in prison. And he was released about a year early. We don't know exactly why, but he did thank us through CPJ for our participation, and he said he thought it had some effect. We've gotten a lot of media internationally that have gotten picked up by outlets, all over the world, and then in particular outlets that care about the 9 journalists that we're highlighting in our, on our bracelets. And then as each person was freed, we've taken another person on to put them on our bracelets. So,
oh yeah, what a wonderful campaign. So it sounds like it started out as just a project in one of your classes, but the resourcefulness and the creativity of your students, and additionally with social media, said, hey, let's do a crowdfunding source and let's come up with the idea for the bracelets. I should mention that I too am a supporter. I learned about the campaign several months ago when you launched it, and am a financial and social media supporter. In fact, I have my bracelet here, but unfortunately, I'm going to report that mine broke, and it's certainly no slight to the strength of it. In fact, briefly, the story I want to tell is that I put it on in August when I received it in the mail, and the name on mine is Ta Phong Tan, who is a blogger from Vietnam. And I started to follow her very closely. And I made a personal vow that once I put it on, I would only take it off once she was released. And I knew that may be for the long haul. And every day that I wore it, I noticed that it would inconveniently get stuck on things. I'm right-handed, and I put it on my right hand. And what would occur to me was that, this woman, this journalist, is imprisoned. What is she going through? And mentally and emotionally, that would affect me. And I thought, given the privileges that I have as a journalist and living in the United States, just the inconvenience of having it, bang on things was the least I could do. About a week ago, it actually broke, just, touching it on my wrist. And then 2 days later, I read that she was released. Now, if there was any superstition there, I don't know. I was really disappointed that it did break, and then could not believe that I had read the news that she was released to the United States. So yeah, and whether the campaign has actually helped or not, maybe that's another undergraduate student, or master's thesis going forward. Do you have any information on her particular release and why she is in the United States? And then further with that, while that is successful news that she's been released, now she is exiled. She's not in her home country of Vietnam. While it is a success, does that also continue and perpetuate the censorship from that country?
Well, those are all good questions, but I want to first start by saying we'll take that as a sign that it was a good thing the bracelet broke, and there's some kind of great karma in there. Well, Vietnam, each of these people we think got released for a goodwill gesture on the part of the country. In Vietnam's case, there was a high-level delegation from the United States that was about to go there, and Vietnam wants some things from the United States that are mainly pretty in the weeds trade preferences and things like that. But it is one way to show goodwill, and it highlights the fact that what the United States does care about, what they make us think about, can make a difference. It's been unfortunate that in this time of unprecedented crackdown on the media overseas, and it really has been an unprecedented time, we can talk more about that later, that the United States has gone quiet on a lot of cases, more quiet than the advocates certainly would like. The Chinese visit here is one example of that. We didn't hear publicly about journalists who were in prison. Maybe there was some talk behind closed doors. But in many cases, the advocates around these prisoners have been criticizing the United States for not being more vocal. In particular, in Egypt, where the United States is still giving a huge amount of military assistance, almost $1 billion, that dates back to the many years. In Azerbaijan, where Khadija Ismailova, who's a phenomenal phenomenal investigative reporter and unearthed, did many stories on Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, a US funded outlet, on the ill-gotten gains, if you will, of the president and his family, the sort of crooked deals that they made for government contracts without ever bidding out those contracts, and have made a huge amount of money and taken a lot of that money offshore and bought property. The government of Azerbaijan has not ever disputed the accuracy of those, but they have nonetheless found her guilty of things like tax evasion and embezzlement and breach of authority. She didn't have any authority as a reporter there, but nevertheless. And it was a trial that was roundly criticized by everyone except the Azerbaijan government for not being fair and not actually offering evidence against her. And now she's been convicted of, I think it's 9 years in prison. And critics say that the US government has not made a big enough deal out of that, hasn't raised the profile. So nevertheless, the 4 prisoners, and Fawn is a good example of this, have, we think, been let out because because they want something from the United States. Mm-hmm. In her case, not only are these trade issues at stake, but the way they went about doing it, which is they basically brought her from the prison directly to an airplane headed to the United States, where she didn't get to see anybody or talk to anybody. She got on the airplane, and then the next thing she knew, she landed in the United States. It's the same thing they did about 6 months ago with another imprisoned journalist named Van High. He too was just taken out of prison, escorted to the plane, and then landed in the United States with no family. There are Vietnamese here, obviously, that he's trying to make a new home for.
I believe
But-
the arrival was LAX, in LA.
Exactly. And there's a big, and that's where Van High went too, because there's a big Vietnamese community in Los Angeles and California. So that's, I think, why they're going there. They may have relatives there.
Has your campaign or you personally had any contact with Ta Fontan or
Not
anyone?
yet. She just, it's so new that we wanted to let her be with her family, let her chill out a little bit. We have had a student who's talked to Van High, the student who had Van High as his research paper, and in the middle of it, he was freed. And so the student made a point of going to visit him in one of his speaking engagements, and he knew who he was, and Van High knew who the student was, because I guess it's a little unusual to have students engaged in this way. So, so that was good. In the Ethiopian case, Riyad Alamu, who was on our bracelets in the first 9, we think that she was let go because President Obama was visiting Ethiopia and they wanted to show goodwill, and they released her right before he got there. So that puts the United States in a situation of, sort of having to recognize that they did something good, and maybe in the Ethiopian mind, more ready to negotiate something that the Ethiopians would like. So unfortunately, after he left, they did round up other bloggers and put them in jail. Not sure for how long yet, but so these things, they do matter.
No, yeah, it brings up an interesting point about the raising awareness, but yet at the same time, does that aggravate further some of these governments or regimes? It seems like a real balancing act that I'm sure CPJ deals with on a regular basis. I'm on their email alerts. I receive 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 alerts a day. Some good news, but mostly about journalists that are being threatened, detained, kidnapped, imprisoned. And I'm certain that they're having discussions about whether to raise awareness, or does it in fact defeat some of the purposes. Have you been involved with any of those discussions or know anything about that balance?
We have, not necessarily with CPJ, but just the students who are reporting. The 2 big countries where this is particularly a problem are China and Iran, which unfortunately are the 2 top 1 and 2 jailers in the world. China being the most and Iran being the second most. And it's not clear that advocacy in the way that it's happened before is gotten anywhere, although, China has released a small number, and Iran also has released a small number of people. So, but we're also told by relatives and Iranian experts that sometimes it can backfire. So before a student gets too far into the reporting, before they reach out to family members, for sure, we like to get the lay of the land of what is it like right now while they're doing their reporting? Is it one of those more touchy moments or not? In the Iranian case, you can use Jason Razian as an example. For the first 6 months that he was in prison, you didn't hear much of anything from the Washington Post leadership, and he works at the Washington Post. But then after that, and I can guess, and it's only a guess, that that's because they were being told it's better for him if you don't make a stink about it right now. But then at a certain point that changed. So again, I'm guessing, but you can kind of read, these are very smart people and don't want to do anything counterproductive. But then went forward with a much larger vocal campaign on his behalf. And in the newspaper today, it says that there is some negotiation. There are 3 Americans that the Americans would like back who are being held in Iranian jails. There are 19 Iranians who are being held by the United States. All of them are, we believe, are on sanctions violations. There have been sanctions between any trade between Iran and the United States, and these are people who try to get around that, selling arms or perhaps things that weren't just arms, but medical equipment or something like that. And so they're in jail now. The good news is that there's at least now some talk about them, whereas before the nuclear deal was signed, there was no talk from the Iranians about Jason. We didn't get hardly any news. The trials were closed. The wife and his mother were not allowed to attend. And so we really, really didn't get much information. Now, a little bit more information, I think, is getting out. And then you have these actual discussions and press comments by the Iranian leadership that means a little bit more movement. So I think a lot of people are hopeful that this will be over soon.
Yeah, let's talk about the work of your students here. Now, you've been an investigative journalist for 25, 30 years. I'm interested to know what it's like to work with a new crop of journalists who also have access to different tools. I mean, of course, those of us who've been in journalism for 25 years have access to those tools too. But there's a different sort of resourcefulness and creativity that comes with that. Tell us a little bit about the access or some of the ways that the students approached this press Uncuffed, and the ways that they've either amazed you or the things that they've been able to accomplish.
Well, they have amazed me, and I've now taught this class. This is my third time, and it now sort of has a rhythm, which is in the beginning, I'm asking students to do something they've never thought of doing or they never thought they could do, which is not only communicate with someone, in Iran or Ethiopia or, Bahrain, but also do a profile about someone who's sitting in the jail over there. And in the beginning, I think there's a lot of trepidation. Well, how in the world am I going to do that? And my role is to sort of point that out, how you can do that. And lo and behold, within the first month, we have great strides where people through social media, and this is the thing that I've learned most, through social media have cracked that door open, have gotten into the networks of Khadija in Azerbaijan or someone else in Russia. In fact, today during our class discussion, we had a student who's working on a Russian case who got a hold of the wife and was able to talk to her. And same with the two Iranian cases where there are relatives who are exiled and they have been able to help get them very close to a prisoner. Same with a Burmese prisoner. We actually had a communication we were able to get questions, the student was able to get questions into the prisoner somehow and get answers back. And he has now a sheet of paper that has the answers to his questions in a prison cell in Burma, and he's sitting here in College Park, Maryland. So these skills that people my generation often looked at as purely social skills really are a fantastic way to hook up to anyone, any place in the world, and get inside, travel with no passport, really. And because of Skype, a virtually free way to communicate with people, either through the phone or through video, you can actually see the people you're communicating with, and you don't have to pay much money to talk to anywhere in the world. So it really has, I think it's surprised them too, how much they are able to do. And I love it because you can see, I get very excited when I see them crack the code, if you will. And I know that once they get to that network, they're going to just be so surprised at the help they get from the people inside the network. Because how many times does a student from the United States want to know about, a small journalist? Because a lot of these journalists aren't that well known in their own countries. I had a student today call up a major newspaper, where there was a reporter at this major newspaper who used to work with a guy in Iran who now is in prison, and that journalist didn't even know he'd been in prison. And so her excitement at being able to bring this news to, a professional journalist who's been doing this for a long time was pretty cool too. So
it seems like those are great successes. And I'm wondering, in terms of ethics, but also tools as journalists today, it's sort of a blessing and a curse, the technology. So on the one hand, we're hearing that, you're in Washington, D.C., or College Park, Maryland, you're basically in the nation's capital, but what if you're in North Dakota? What if you're in Bellingham, Washington, which is where I'm located now? It sounds like using social media, you can have access around the world. At the same time, is there a generation of journalists who don't leave their desktop and understand the value of the journalism that I'm sure you did in college and your days starting out, which was get out of the office. You don't need to work the phone. You need to work in person, those primary sources. It seems like a real balance.
Well, that's why I decided to start teaching, actually, because I saw too many young journalists come into the newsroom who didn't get out of the newsroom, meet sources, cultivate sources, and were content with emailing people. Well, in my class, you can email people to set up an interview, but not email them to do the interview. I also require them to go and meet with people that they can go and meet with in Washington. Washington, it could, it's the nation's capital, but it's also kind of run like a small town where once you know how it works, everyone's connected somehow to everyone else. And so people who are former government officials, former ambassadors, or formerly working in the government in a given country somewhere could be hanging out at a think tank now and much more readily accessible. But we have the State Department directory too. So we have students calling straight into the State Department to try to get a hold of the desk officers who are in charge of that country and who should know about, a journalist sitting there, or the International Red Cross, or many other organizations that really make it their business to watch the fate of these prisoners. It really is a borderless place once you figure out social media and how it can be used to contact people. And so, they can do things that I definitely never knew how to do in most of my career. And that is going to, if they can get out of the office and be more comfortable making sources with this technology, they really do have the chance to be the best generation of accountability and investigative reporters ever. It's just combining those two things and getting people to leave the office that, that's what I figure my job is. And to also help them know what kind of power these tools that they already are using for other things have for reporting.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it, to say it's borderless, because truly it is. Let's talk a little bit about your career, because it's not every day that you get the chance to speak to a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who, of course, that's a wonderful accolade, but you've been in the business for 25, 30 plus years? I'll let you give us the math. Either due to downsizing or financial concerns, people have moved into different industries, changed careers, they put on the PR hat. So it's wonderful, obviously, to see someone with the longevity and the loyalty to the craft and the career. What is most alarming to you in the time that you've been a journalist? It's 2015 now, just looking back over the last few decades. Is there something that sticks out to you the most here in the US or worldwide?
Well, unfortunately, yes, there is. There's not just one thing, but I do think that this blurring of the lines about what is journalism really? Right now, we're in this very chaotic phase where things pass as journalism that I don't think are journalism, and I want to say, the aggregation of other people's work is not journalism. It's something, and it's something of value. It's something that people obviously want to read because they don't want to have to go through a lot of different publications. But to me, what a good journalist is someone who knows how to get original information, things that other people don't have. And the harder something is to get, the more valuable in a way it is in my mind, because government and any big institution is going to put up a wall to truthful information because they just, it's sort of the nature of the beam. So I do see so many people coming into our newsroom who know a lot of technology. They know a lot of how to aggregate. They know how to have an opinion about things, and this was something that I was just drilled into me that I'm not supposed to have. But they get, accolades for having this opinion about something, even though they're 24 years old and really don't have much life experience. Hopefully that'll change. And I do see some of the newer media swinging. It's like the pendulum swinging back. Like, so you look at Mashable, you look at Vice, you look at, a couple other the websites who originally started as aggregators Now they want to hire actual journalists to find original, never before seen information. I think that's a great trend. And I think it means they want to be taken seriously and they want to have an impact. And yes, you can have an impact if you're the snarkiest person and you happen to be clever and have a lot of followers. But I don't know, what kind of impact really is that? To me, the whole idea of becoming a public affairs, government accountability reporter is to shine the light on things that are hidden in the darkness. And usually that means things that are causing people to suffer, or injustice, or inefficiency at the least. And that's what I've done in most of my career. And that's really, I think, what the value of the news reporter can be at any level, on, you know, the cop beat, the court beat, the classroom beat, or the CIA beat, you know, and everything in between. It's really to get behind that wall of, you know, happy talk and figure out what's really going on.
I was reading the university's website, which had some information from you, maybe from a lecture, and it mentioned in the article, either you had asked the question or somebody had asked you, who is a journalist? And you said in that report, a graduate student at Merrill named it for me. You are a journalist if you're trying to act like one.
Right. And what I mean by that is not, you know, you put on the press hat or you're at a press conference. That's not what I mean. What I've learned from this class, or from the research that I did in this class, is, you know, there aren't Washington Posts all over the world. There aren't even small papers with many resources to do journalism like I've done it. There are people, individuals, who will take up the task of trying to figure out what's happening on their block or in their neighborhood or in their city, and get around authorities sometimes to post them on a website or on their own blog. If those people are really trying to unearth information and share it to the public, they're acting like a journalist. And I don't care what we call them then. You know, I think journalism, those people are more journalists to me than the journalists who sit in the newsroom and aggregate someone else's information. To give you a great example of this, there was a doctor in a border state, Reynosa, on the border of Mexico and the United States. And the drug cartels had imposed a news blackout in her city on any crime reporting, any deaths, any cartel violence. And if you broke that, you were killed. So the newspaper stopped reporting on the biggest story that affects people's lives in those cities. And what she did is she started her own blog under a pseudonym, and she went about trying to collect from the police and from her other sources on the street, you know, who had disappeared, where they thought they were, when did it happen, who ended up, you know, whose body ended up being discovered on the street, how many, you know, where were the gunshots at that moment so people could stay away. And she got away with it for a couple years. And then the cartels hacked her account and figured out who she really was. And then they killed her. And they killed her on her own Twitter feed. So is that woman a journalist? In my mind, she is. She was trying to unearth what was going on and trying to share it with people. And even though she was just doing it on Twitter and she was a doctor by profession, you know, why wouldn't we call her a journalist?
What did you mean they killed her on her Twitter feed?
Well, she disappeared. And then the next thing you knew, her Twitter account came alive, and it was a picture of her in her last moments talking to people, her loved ones. And then the next shot was her on the ground dead.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So yeah, it was hacked, and then it was broadcast through her feed. Yeah.
Right. Right. And the other thing that is different in most parts of the world is that journalists are aligned with a political party or a pro-democracy in a lot of places where the media is not independent and the government is authoritarian and not democratic. To be a journalist is often to be associated with the pro-democracy movements. Often those are banned. So the act of being a journalist in many countries is an act of defiance, and it's an act of subversion. even though you're not violent and don't advocate violence, and you're advocating things we would hold up as, basic rights, in many countries you're considered a dissident, and you put your life on the line, or your well-being at least on the line, just for doing that. So that's happening in so many countries around the world now.
And what you bring up is really, what is the definition of journalism? I mean, there are countries and cultures where, I mean, it really is a construct, journalism, and there are countries that don't recognize that. Or as you said, to be a journalist means to set yourself in a position where you will be inherently challenging authority, right?
That's right. And they're often charged with challenging the state, or in the mind of the authorities, in trying to undermine the state, or take that one step further and being treasonous or being a traitor. Khadija Ismailova, again, even though her reports were not criticized for their inaccuracy, doesn't mean they think they were accurate or anything. They just never addressed that. But she was criticized for being a traitor because she unearthed the business dealings of the president and his family. So yeah, it's one step further. It's not just criticizing in their minds. It's often undermining. In Saudi Arabia, I mean, the fact is that in a lot of the places where journalists are treated the worst, they are U.S. allies. Throughout the Middle East, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, UAE, none of those places have a free press or an independent press, and some of them have gone backwards since the Arab Spring. They're all countries that we have favorable relationships with at the same time. So the U.S. has a very bifurcated relationship with those countries.
I think it's Julian Assange, who's the founder of WikiLeaks, said, if journalism is good, it is controversial by its nature. Whether or not you're a Julian Assange fan, I agree with that quote. I actually have it as a tagline on my email address. Let's shift the focus to you, if you don't mind, just in terms of someone who lives in Washington, D.C., and the nation's capital, some of the countries that you have visited, and also now that you are a professor at the university, how are you balancing that with your own reporting? Or are you fully a professor at this time, or do you plan to go back? How are you juggling those different things, Dana?
Well, at the moment, I'm working full-time here and then part-time at the Post. So I'm doing a series a year now at the Post, and the first series was on this issue, was on the issue of free speech around, or freedom of press around the world. So I tried to cleverly combine the two. Actually, I didn't know that's how it would work out, but that's when I started teaching the class, I felt like I learned about a whole world that I had not known about before, as I was only practicing journalism. So I took my best students, and 3 or 4 of them helped me co-report the series that we've been doing under the tagline of controlling the story. And we've done 4 stories so far, and we'll do at least 1 more before the end of the year. So giving them a more intense sort of mentorship opportunity, and me using them to do a lot of work that would add up to a story. In one case, there was a student who is Pakistani by origin, and he went to Pakistan and profiled a person who had survived an assassination attempt on his life, a journalist, Ahmed Mir, who has 6 bullets in his body and will not leave Pakistan because he fears that if he leaves, more of his colleagues will be endangered. And so he's staying there, trying to continue to be a reporter, even though he still receives death threats.
Oh, okay.
So
does that go back to the issue you brought up earlier when we talked about our Vietnamese blogger Ta Phong Tan, who, when she was released, while that is great news, she was released directly to the United States. That in itself sort of disseminates and what's the word? It kind of takes away the fact that she can't support her fellow bloggers. And we should mention too that her history is that she was a police officer. She wasn't necessarily a journalist, but like you were saying before, with other folks who've spoken out against their governments, they may have been a doctor or had other careers, but what is a journalist? So yeah, something about those folks being in exile.
Well, in the, those countries are so different than one another. So Vietnam, if you came out and you, so they imprisoned her. They didn't imprison Ahmed Mir. They just, countries either find ways to kill journalists they don't like or to imprison them. You usually don't find both. So in the Pakistani case, as far as I know, there isn't a Pakistani journalist in prison, but there are dozens of them that have been killed. And of course, their killers are never found. In Ahmed Mir's case, he believes that it's the security services that have been targeting him. And he said that, which has made him very unpopular, not only with the security services, but with people who support them. So he can live in Pakistan. They're not trying to kick him out or anything, but he lives under the fear of death really any day. In Vietnam, they don't necessarily kill journalists they don't like, but they do imprison them. So she really didn't have much of a choice. If she wanted to maintain, well, she didn't have any choice whether to live in Vietnam. That was the deal the Vietnamese struck with the Americans. You can have her, but she's not living here freely. And that's partly because they definitely do not want an agitator like she would be to be out in the streets. But Vietnam is, a communist country basically, where there's no free speech. Any freedom of expression or free press is on the internet in a very underground way. In Pakistan, that's not the case. There's a lot of, there's many outlets. It's kind of a crazy press situation. Not all of it's accurate at all. But what's a red line in Pakistan is reporting on the security services, and in particular, some of their campaigns in certain parts of the country that are very controversial. And of course, that's what he was doing, because that was what the hardest truth to get at was. So in his case, he could leave the country, and so many of his friends say, for your own sake, you should leave the country, but he just won't do it. So very different situations there.
Yeah, I really appreciate your knowledge and your understanding of what's going on in each of these countries. We're going to move into our final segment here, but before we do that, anything else to encapsulate or add about Press Uncuffed or this campaign that people should know about, maybe that we didn't touch on?
Well, we still are selling the bracelets, and you can go on pressuncuffed.org, and you'll see the website that the students created, one student in particular. You can read a little bit more about the mission and how it started, and you can read profiles of each of the journalists. So we're still trying to do that, and we're because this is student-led, we kind of have to go on the students' pace. So they've just come back from the summer. Now they're trying to gear up to find a retailer who will sell the bracelets. So you could find one place to get them. We are going to add new ones on, and we're trying to build the social media presence. We are linking with the individual campaigns that already exist overseas, and we also want to reach out to students in other campuses. We don't want to have this just be the University of Maryland. And we're going soon, by December, we'll have a website up on the Capital News Service, which is the student online newspaper here, that will be a freedom of press, privacy, and surveillance website. And we want to encourage undergrads who have either articles or papers, research papers that they write on any of those subjects, to submit them, so that we can have an undergraduate presence, a place where undergraduates can go and debate these issues and see what other people are working on.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. The only downside working with students is that they graduate and they move on.
It came as a big surprise to me last year, my first year. All my students left. Like, where are you going?
Yeah. It's the one bummer, but then they move on, hopefully in journalism careers, and they become ambassadors, which is great. So it's great that you get to work with their energy, and I'm sure they're happy to work with you and all the experience that you've had in your career. Let's move to our final segment. I like to call this Jennifer's 5 W's and an H. This, of course, is structured after the who, what, where, why, when, and how of good news writing. You've heard of that, I'm sure. So I'm going to ask you a few questions that require a good memory or a one-word response or whatever comes to mind first. It's real simple like that. But yeah, let's start. Who was your first grade teacher, Dana?
Mrs. McKibben.
Okay. You think she's listening today?
I hope so.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What's your hometown, by the way?
Well, Canoga Park, California.
Okay, great. What was your nickname in high school or college?
Dana Banana.
Dana Banana, okay.
Or some people called me Rabbi Priest.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not telling you that it's great. They're great nicknames, but
that's what nicknames are, though. Someone comes up with something bizarre. When did you first realize you wanted to be a reporter?
Well, I had my first newspaper with my best friend Jennifer when I was in second grade, but then I took a big hiatus, and it wasn't until graduate school that I really decided that that's what I wanted to do.
Was there a name for that newspaper in second grade?
I don't remember. Yeah.
Okay. Where were you on July 20th, 1969? And this is the day that the United States walked on the moon.
Oh. Well, I was at home. 69, I was 8. No, that's not right. 69, I was, yeah. And I was 11. I was I saw it in the den in our house. That I remember, because all the kids, I have 3 brothers and sisters, and we all were there with my mom and my dad watching the spacewalk. Definitely.
On television.
I can remember the shag green carpet, the black and white TV, and the dog at our feet, Duffy.
Nice. Why do you think it's important that young people go into the profession of journalism today?
Well, 2 main reasons. The first is that it is the most important way that people get their information, whether they realize it or not. It's not from public officials. It's not from your doctor. It's from the news media. And secondly, because it is so much fun to be a reporter. And so, I think everybody should be lucky enough to have a job that they love and that they continually learn new things. At least that's how I feel. And this is definitely that job. You're doing a new thing every day. So great fun.
And one last question that possibly some of your students may ask is, how do you suggest a new journalist get a job at the Washington Post?
The only way to get jobs these days is to do internships while you're a student. I mean, that's how I got a job. And then, and then internships really have become a staple at journalism schools. So do as many as you can. You might get an internship at at the place you worked, which was my case, although it was like my 4th internship. Or, you'll at least have clips or videos or something that you can show to a prospective employer. So it really is a great way to try to do that. And that's the single most important thing I would give for a piece of advice.
Yeah, sounds like good advice. I mean, really, you can show them your transcript from college, but you want to have those clips. You want to have, what is your one best story or your top 3 stories? I mean, any employer is going to want to hear you talk about the steps you took to do the actual reporting. And I would think a good internship at the Post or wherever, even at your local paper, would be a great way to start.
Yep. And they really need you now because everyone's shorthanded. So the chances of you being able to get to do something important is better than it was, when I was an intern, where you just had to basically figure out what is somebody not covering because we had such a big staff. But that's not the case in most places. So your work is needed.
Well, thank you, Dana, so much. Really appreciate being able to talk to you today, straight from Washington, D.C., to share your knowledge and your experience, and also the importance of this campaign, the Press Uncuffed. People can go on the website, pressuncuffed.org. There's a Facebook page, Twitter, follow all of those things, and certainly I'll promote more information on my website, jenniferkarchmer.com. Thank you again to Dana and everyone watching. This is Jennifer Karchmer and the Transparency Report. You can find more information on my website and social media. Thank you again, and have a great day.